This is not just an ordinary photograph. It was taken in 1871 inside the walls of Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. At first glance, you see only a young girl, Catherine Doyle, just 9 years old. But when you stare into her eyes, something feels wrong. Her expression carries a weight that no child should ever possess, a presence that unsettles even the most skeptical observer. Look closely, and you'll notice what countless doctors, priests, and historians have whispered for more than 150 years. Catherine was no ordinary child. The image you're seeing is more than a relic of the Victorian era. It is a doorway into one of the most disturbing medical mysteries ever recorded. A case so baffling that neither modern science nor psychology has been able to fully explain it. This girl, who once lived a perfectly normal life in Boston, would suddenly transform into something beyond comprehension. She spoke secrets no child should know. She predicted deaths with impossible precision. She carried knowledge of languages and philosophies that she had never been taught. And she left behind a trail of fear so deep that even today her story is studied, debated, and feared. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is the meticulously documented case of Catherine Doyle, a story that challenges everything we know about the limits of the human mind. From the dark halls of asylums to the failed rituals of the church, and from medical archives to chilling photographs, this mystery has never truly been solved. Before we begin this journey into the shadows of history, make sure to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and share your thoughts in the comments. Your curiosity fuels the stories we uncover, and tonight's story is one you will never forget. The year was 1871. America was still a nation stitched together by fragile threads after the Civil War, a country haunted by memories of bloodshed that had ended just 6 years earlier. In the bustling city of Boston, change was everywhere. Waves of immigrants arrived daily, most of them Irish families escaping famine, poverty, and persecution. They came searching for survival, not fortune, and often found themselves trapped in overcrowded neighborhoods where life was hard but community was strong. It was in this world that Catherine Doyle was born. Her father, Patrick, worked long hours at Boston's busy port, hauling heavy cargo from ships that crossed the Atlantic. Her mother, Mary, worked as a domestic servant in the elegant homes of Beacon Hill, cleaning and cooking for the wealthy elite. They lived in a cramped 2-room apartment in Boston's North End, a neighborhood thick with the smell of bread from local bakeries, the sound of Irish songs spilling from taverns, and the prayers of families holding tight to their faith. For the first 7 years of her life, Catherine seemed like any other child. She played with rag dolls stitched by her mother's hands, attended Sunday Mass at St. Leonard's Church, and learned her letters from the parish schoolteachers. Her family described her as sweet, helpful, and curious. Nothing about her life suggested that she would soon become the center of one of the most inexplicable cases in medical history. But beyond the Doyle household, another world was waiting, dark, oppressive, and merciless. It was the world of the asylum. Psychiatric medicine in the Victorian era was still primitive, bound by fear rather than understanding. Those who did not fit social norms were hidden from society, confined in massive institutions built on isolation, control, and despair. The Danvers State Hospital, where Catherine's life would eventually end, was one of these institutions. Its Gothic towers rose above the Massachusetts countryside like a medieval fortress, intimidating and cold. Inside, treatment often meant cruelty disguised as science. Patients endured ice-cold baths, physical restraints, sensory deprivation, and experimental procedures that today would be considered torture. The halls echoed with screams, prayers, and the metallic rattle of keys locking doors behind the forgotten. To understand the tragedy of Catherine Doyle, we must understand this brutal context. She was a child of immigrants, growing up in a city struggling to redefine itself, and she lived in a time when mental illness was not a subject of compassion but of fear. Any deviation from normal behavior risked being labeled madness, and madness meant confinement. The story you are about to follow unfolds in this atmosphere of superstition, ignorance, and desperation. A society where religion and science clashed, where priests performed exorcisms in candlelit rooms while doctors scribbled notes about hysteria and delusion. In that uncertain space between faith and medicine, Catherine Doyle became something neither world could explain. What began as the life of an ordinary Irish-American girl would turn into a nightmare that defied every boundary of knowledge. And it all started with a single morning in September 1869, when Catherine woke up different. But before we turn to that moment, the instant her life and her family's reality changed forever, remember to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows. Share in the comments what you would have believed if you had lived in 1871. Was it madness, possession, or something darker still? It happened on a Tuesday morning in September 1869, a day that Mary Doyle would later describe as the day she lost her daughter forever. Catherine was 7 years old. Until then, she had been a sweet, playful child, the light of her parents' modest home in Boston's North End. But on that morning, something in her had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. Mary noticed the first sign when Catherine did not wake at her usual hour. She had always been an early riser, bounding out of bed with energy. That day she came down late, moving with a strange deliberation, every step measured as if carefully planned. She sat at the breakfast table without speaking, staring at her parents with a gaze so still it unsettled them. When Mary gently asked if she felt unwell, Catherine answered, but her voice was different. It was rougher, lower, as if it belonged to someone older, someone who had lived far more years than her small body could claim. At first, Patrick and Mary told themselves it was nothing, a bad dream, a childish mood, perhaps the beginnings of an illness. But within days, their denial turned to dread. Catherine began saying things no child could know. At dinner, she spoke casually about the American Revolutionary War, describing battles in detail that even her father, who had worked among men of all kinds at the docks, did not know. She quoted ancient philosophers with a precision and understanding far beyond her age. When Patrick asked where she had learned such things, Catherine only smiled, a smile that chilled her parents more than her words. Her religious knowledge grew in the same uncanny way. Once she had struggled to memorize simple prayers in Latin, but now she recited obscure passages from the Old Testament flawlessly. Father O'Brien, the parish priest who tested her, was left shaken when she debated theology with him as though she were a seasoned scholar. The child he had baptized now seemed to carry the mind of someone far older, far stranger. More alarming still were the secrets she began to reveal. At neighborhood gatherings, she would mention hidden debts, private affairs, and sins no child should know. She spoke these things calmly, as if discussing the weather, leaving adults pale and trembling. Neighbors began to avoid the Doyle home, whispering that something unnatural had taken hold of the girl. Mary watched in growing horror as her daughter's sweet nature faded. Catherine's playfulness disappeared, replaced by a fascination with death and suffering. She asked disturbing questions about torture, executions, and disease, not with fear but with curiosity. Sometimes she hurt herself, scratching her skin or biting her lips until they bled, yet she showed no pain. Instead, she seemed almost pleased, as if pain gave her a secret satisfaction. Patrick, a man of simple faith, tried to discipline her, hoping sternness would banish the strange behavior. But nothing changed. If anything, the girl seemed to enjoy her parents' fear. Her eyes, once warm and bright, now carried a darkness that unnerved everyone who looked too long. Some nights, Mary swore they seemed almost black, as if something else stared back through them. The Doyle family, once filled with laughter, became silent and tense. Meals were eaten in dread, prayers said with trembling voices. The transformation was undeniable. Their daughter was still with them in body, but her spirit, whatever it had become, was something else entirely. And this was only the beginning. The changes that followed would grow darker, stranger, and more terrifying than Patrick and Mary Doyle could ever imagine. Before we step deeper into this story, tell me in the comments below. If your own child woke up one morning speaking secrets no one should know, would you call a doctor, a priest, or run in fear? And don't forget to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. As the weeks passed, What began as unsettling differences in Catherine's voice and behavior grew into something far more terrifying. Her parents had hoped she might simply return to her old self, but instead each day revealed new layers of strangeness, layers no child of 7 years should ever display. It started with knowledge. At first, Catherine surprised her parents by mentioning details of history she had never been taught. Soon it became undeniable. At family meals, she spoke of battles from the American Revolution as though she had stood on the battlefield. She named generals, quoted speeches, and described strategies that no ordinary schoolchild could possibly know. When questioned, she simply replied, "I've always known these things." Her fascination with philosophy appeared next. In conversations, Catherine quoted Aristotle, Plato, and other ancient thinkers. These were not rote recitations but reasoned arguments, spoken with clarity far beyond her years. Her parochial teachers, baffled, insisted she had never had access to such writings. Yet when pressed, Catherine debated like a philosopher, her small voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. Her religious knowledge deepened as well. At church, she recited long, obscure passages from the Bible in fluent Latin. Priests who tested her were astonished to find her speaking with the confidence of trained seminarians. She asked questions about theology that unsettled even the most devout, probing at contradictions and mysteries of faith with a maturity that bordered on blasphemy. Father O'Brien, once a proud teacher of his parish children, left encounters with Catherine shaken and silent. If this extraordinary knowledge had been her only transformation, perhaps her case would have remained curious but not frightening. But Catherine also knew things she could not possibly have learned. She revealed the secret sins of neighbors, whispering about debts, affairs, and hidden shames that no child or adult should know. When confronted, she did not deny it. Instead, she smiled coldly, as though enjoying the discomfort she caused. Families who once welcomed the Doyles into their homes now crossed the street to avoid them. Catherine had become the subject of fearful whispers. Then came her growing fascination with death. Catherine's curiosity about life faded, replaced by an obsession with suffering and mortality. She asked her parents how executions were carried out. She spoke casually of medieval torture methods, describing them in disturbing detail. She even referenced ancient Egyptian mummification as if she had witnessed it herself. Most chilling of all, she seemed to take pleasure in these topics. When speaking about pain, her eyes lit up, and she smiled in a way that made adults uneasy. This fascination extended into her own body. Catherine began harming herself, not out of childish clumsiness but deliberate intent. She scratched her arms with nails until she bled, bit her lips until they were raw, and struck her head against the wall with alarming force. Yet she never cried, never flinched. Instead, she seemed entranced, almost ecstatic, as though pain itself gave her a strange satisfaction. Her parents tried to stop her, but Catherine always found ways to continue. Every attempt to intervene ended with her quiet, unnerving reply, "I feel like it or something asked me to." Animals, once her companions, now recoiled from her. Stray cats that she used to feed hissed and ran at her approach. Dogs barked wildly, straining against their leashes as if warning their owners. Even birds seemed to avoid flying near her. When Mary asked why the animals reacted so strangely, Catherine gave the same unsettling smile and answered, "They know what I am now, Mommy. They're smarter than you." The Doyle household, once filled with laughter, became a place of dread. Mary prayed desperately for her daughter, but her prayers seemed unanswered. Patrick, strong from years of dock work, admitted he feared his own child. Neighbors no longer visited, and whispers spread through the North End that the Doyle girl was cursed, perhaps possessed. What terrified the parents most was not simply what Catherine said or did. It was the chilling calm with which she did it. There was no tantrum, no childish rebellion. Only a composed, deliberate strangeness that made her seem less like a child and more like something ancient wearing a child's face. And so, by the end of 1869, the Doyles found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Their daughter was still alive, still present in body, but the sweet spirit they had once known was gone. In her place stood a girl who spoke with the knowledge of ages, sought out suffering, and frightened both man and beast alike. What would you do if your child suddenly knew things no child could ever know? Share your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories that defy explanation and test the limits of what we believe possible. For devout Catholics like Patrick and Mary Doyle, the first answer to their daughter's strange transformation was not medicine, but faith. When whispers of Catherine's disturbing behavior spread through the neighborhood, the Doyles turned to Father Timothy O'Brien of St. Leonard's Church. He had baptized Catherine, watched her grow, and once called her one of the sweetest children in his parish. Surely, if anyone could help, it was him. At first, Father O'Brien dismissed the reports. He believed Mary and Patrick's fears were the exaggerated worries of parents under stress. Children sometimes pass through strange phases, he told them. Surely Catherine's odd knowledge and unsettling demeanor could be explained by chance, imagination, or overheard conversations. That confidence crumbled the moment he sat with Catherine. During a pastoral visit in early 1870, Father O'Brien tried to engage her in simple conversation about prayer. Instead, Catherine turned the discussion into a debate on doctrine, raising questions so complex that even seasoned theologians might hesitate. She quoted obscure texts, pressed him on contradictions, and spoke with the authority of someone far older than her years. Then came the moment that froze the priest's faith. Catherine began recounting private details of his life, sins from his youth, doubts he had never shared, even painful memories from his childhood in Ireland. She spoke them calmly, with that cold smile that had become her signature. Shaken to his core, Father O'Brien concluded that Catherine was not merely troubled. Something darker had taken root. He decided an exorcism was necessary. The ritual was performed one night in the Doyle home, with only the family and an elderly deacon present. Candles flickered as Latin prayers filled the air. The priest expected screams, writhing, curses, the signs described in church manuals. Instead, Catherine sat calmly. Then she laughed. It was not the laugh of a child. It echoed unnaturally, as though multiple voices poured from her small frame. As Father O'Brien spoke the words of the rite, Catherine spoke them too, matching him line for line in perfect Latin, anticipating each phrase before he could finish. The effect was chilling, as if she were not the one being exorcised, but the one performing the ritual. The exorcism failed. Father O'Brien never spoke of that night publicly, but in his private diary, later discovered, he confessed it was the most terrifying experience of his priesthood. For the Doyles, the attempt confirmed their worst fears. Their daughter was beyond the reach of prayer. Afterward, the family's isolation deepened. Neighbors whispered that even the priest could not help them. Mary clung to her rosary, Patrick to his silence, but both knew they stood powerless against whatever their child had become. And Catherine? She only seemed amused, as though the church's greatest weapon had been no more than a game. Would you have trusted faith, medicine, or fled in fear? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories where faith and fear collide in the darkest corners of history. After the failed exorcism, Patrick and Mary Doyle turned to the only other authority they could trust: medicine. If faith had no answer, perhaps science might explain their daughter's terrifying condition. In February 1870, they brought Catherine to Dr. Henry Morrison, one of Boston's few physicians specializing in mental disorders. Dr. Morrison was not a man prone to superstition. Trained in Europe, he had studied under some of the pioneers of modern psychiatry. He believed in careful observation, clinical documentation, and rational explanation. When he first heard the Doyles' desperate account, he assumed he was dealing with a highly intelligent child whose imagination, perhaps fueled by trauma, had spiraled out of control. He expected exaggeration, not the extraordinary. That confidence lasted until his first session with Catherine. Over the course of 2 weeks, Dr. Morrison studied her carefully. At first, she seemed calm, polite, and cooperative. But as their conversations deepened, Morrison realized he was facing something he could neither categorize nor ignore. Catherine displayed intelligence far beyond her age, but her focus was unnerving. She spoke with fascination about human anatomy, describing organs, veins, and diseases with the precision of a medical student. When Morrison tested her with questions drawn from European textbooks, she answered correctly, and then expanded on them with details he himself had only recently encountered in journals. Catherine constantly wrote and drew during their sessions. But her papers did not show flowers, houses, or animals, as most children's drawings might. Instead, she sketched anatomically correct skeletons, bodies in decay, and human figures in grotesque positions of agony. The detail was astounding, far beyond what a child with no training should achieve. Even stranger were her writings. Catherine produced texts in Latin, ancient Greek, and even crude Egyptian hieroglyphs. Morrison had no explanation. She had never studied these languages, yet she wrote with fluency, sometimes slipping from one to another without hesitation. When asked how she had learned, she replied simply, "The words come when I need them." What disturbed Morrison most, however, was Catherine's gaze. He described in his notes the unnerving sensation of being analyzed when he looked into her eyes. It was not the look of a child, but of something older, patient, and calculating. He admitted that prolonged eye contact made him dizzy, unsettled, and strangely vulnerable, as though she could see thoughts he had never spoken. Physical anomalies soon joined the psychological ones. Catherine's body temperature ran lower than normal, yet she showed no signs of illness. Her pulse was unusually slow but steady. Most disturbingly, plants in Morrison's office withered after her visits, even when other conditions remained stable. He recorded the phenomenon meticulously, unable to explain it. By the end of his study, Morrison's skepticism was shattered. He could no longer dismiss Catherine's case as imagination or hysteria. In his reports, preserved in Boston's medical archives, he described her condition as a constellation of symptoms beyond the reach of current science. He confessed that medicine could observe, document, and measure, but not explain. The Doyles had turned to the church and found no comfort. They had turned to medicine and found only more questions. With each attempt to seek help, the mystery surrounding Catherine deepened, and the sense of dread within her family grew heavier. For Patrick and Mary, the realization was unbearable. Their daughter was now beyond both faith and science. Would you have trusted the doctor's notes, or believed Catherine was something more than medicine could define? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more documented mysteries that still haunt the line between science and the unknown. By March of 1870, the Doyle family reached a breaking point. Faith had failed them, medicine had failed them, and the girl they once called their joy now terrified them more each day. At the urging of Father O'Brien and Dr. Morrison, Patrick and Mary made the most painful decision of their lives. Catherine would be sent to the Danvers State Hospital, the towering institution that loomed above the Massachusetts countryside like a castle of despair. The hospital was infamous even in its own time. Built in the Gothic Revival style, its pointed towers and endless corridors seemed less like a place of healing and more like a fortress built to contain shadows. Inside, the air was thick with disinfectant that failed to mask the stench of sweat and fear. The halls echoed with the cries of the disturbed, the rattle of chains, and the low murmurs of souls long forgotten by the outside world. Treatments included cold baths that lasted hours, restraints that left bruises, and experimental procedures that often caused more suffering than relief. Into this grim world stepped Catherine Doyle. She was escorted into the office of Dr. Elias Hartwell, the hospital's chief physician. Hartwell had studied psychiatry in Paris and prided himself on modern methods, though by today's standards his practices were still harsh. He expected to see a frightened child, confused and weeping at her sudden confinement. Instead, Catherine entered calmly, her posture straight, her gaze calculating. She seemed less like a patient arriving for care than a guest arriving with knowledge of what was to come. In her first meeting with Dr. Hartwell, Catherine unsettled him by revealing details she could not possibly have known. She spoke of patients who had died within the hospital, recounting names, dates, and intimate details that were locked in private files. Then, with unnerving precision, she mentioned aspects of Hartwell's own life, private doubts, childhood memories, and decisions he had never shared aloud. Hartwell, a man of science, left that meeting shaken in ways he could not explain. Initially, Catherine was placed in the hospital's pediatric ward. Here, among 20 other children with various conditions, her presence soon proved disruptive, not through violence but through influence. Within a week, children who had been stable grew silent, withdrawn, and strange. They sat in odd formations, stared at walls as if seeing things invisible to adults, and even spoke in unison with words no one understood. One girl, admitted for recurring nightmares, began describing a tall woman dressed in black with eyes like dark holes. Another child spoke in detail about Catherine's home in Boston, a place he had never seen. Soon, several of the children began whispering the same stories, repeating Catherine's memories and secrets as though they were their own. The staff at first dismissed this as childish hysteria. But as the behaviors spread, even the most skeptical nurses grew uneasy. Children recited passages in languages they had never studied. They described visions of shadowy figures moving through the ward. They grew restless at night, whispering in the dark until their voices rose together in eerie chants. It became clear that Catherine was not just a patient. She was a presence. After 6 weeks, Dr. Hartwell made the decision to remove her from the ward and place her in an isolation room. It was not her actions that demanded it, but her influence. Catherine had become a contagion of the unexplainable, and the hospital could no longer ignore it. Her transfer to isolation marked a new phase in her story, a phase where science would try and fail to measure the immeasurable. If you walked the halls of Danvers in 1870, would you have dared to enter Catherine's room? Comment your answer, and remember to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories where the walls of history still whisper in the dark. Catherine Doyle's transfer to isolation was not a punishment. She had not lashed out violently, nor had she broken the rules of the ward. Yet her very presence had begun reshaping the minds of children around her, leaving Dr. Elias Hartwell no choice. If she could influence others so easily, perhaps in solitude her condition could be studied without spreading further. Her new room was stark, a narrow cell in the east wing of Danvers. It contained only an iron bed, a wooden table, a chair, and a small barred window. The walls were bare, the air colder than the rest of the hospital. To other children, the ward was a prison. To Catherine, it was simply another stage. She entered without fear, sitting quietly as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. From the first days in isolation, her interactions with Dr. Hartwell unsettled him. Instead of answering his questions like a patient, she often reversed the roles. She asked about his life, his childhood fears, his hidden doubts. She described in detail an accident from his youth, the drowning of a childhood friend he had never spoken of aloud. Her knowledge was precise down to the weather and the words exchanged. Hartwell left these sessions shaken, questioning not only Catherine's condition but his own sanity. Other phenomena soon surrounded her room. Nurses reported that the air grew icy whenever they approached. The temperature was consistently 4 to 6 degrees lower than the rest of the building, regardless of heating. Plants placed by the window withered within days. Guards complained of headaches, dizziness, and the unsettling sensation of being watched even when Catherine lay motionless in bed. 2 eventually requested transfers, unable to bear the constant unease. Hartwell, determined to pursue knowledge, intensified his studies. He administered advanced memory tests, logic puzzles, and historical questions designed for highly educated adults. Catherine passed them all with disturbing ease. When presented with obscure documents or photographs of strangers long dead, she recited names, histories, and personal details that proved accurate upon investigation. She also began making predictions. At first, Hartwell dismissed them as coincidence, but his skepticism eroded quickly. Catherine foretold the deaths of 3 hospital patients, naming not only the day but the manner in which each would die. When the events occurred exactly as she described, Hartwell was forced to admit that chance could no longer explain her words. Even more unsettling were her episodes of rigidity. Sometimes she would sit or stand motionless for hours, unblinking, her body as stiff as stone. During these states, the supernatural activity around her intensified. Objects shifted on their own, metal rattled, and staff swore they heard whispers in languages they could not recognize. At times, Catherine's voice joined these whispers, low, layered, resonant, as though multiple voices spoke through her small frame. Hartwell documented everything meticulously. His notes described a girl who was both subject and controller, both patient and observer. She was not passive in her examinations. She guided them, using her knowledge like a scalpel, cutting into the minds of those around her. More than once, Hartwell confessed in his private journals that Catherine seemed to know him better than he knew himself. For the doctors of Danvers, Catherine became more than a case. She was an event, a phenomenon, something that could not be explained by hysteria, epilepsy, or any known condition. And yet, even as her power seemed to grow, her body began to fail. Catherine grew pale, her skin almost translucent, her frame thinner each week. It was as though the more she revealed, the more she withered. The doctors did not know it yet, but Catherine Doyle was moving toward the moment that would define her forever. The day her image would be captured, and her gaze frozen in a photograph that still chills observers more than a century later. If you want to see how science and mystery collide, stay with us, and remember to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories where even the strongest minds struggle to find answers. By the summer of 1871, Dr. Hartwell had observed Catherine for more than a year. He had documented her knowledge, her predictions, her episodes of rigidity, and the chilling phenomena that surrounded her. Yet he felt something remained unseen, something that escaped his written notes. Convinced that a photograph might capture what the eye could not, Hartwell arranged for a professional session. The photographer was James Thornton, a man experienced in medical portraits. He had captured hundreds of patients in asylums, but none would test his nerves like this. Thornton arrived with heavy equipment, camera, glass plates, chemicals, and was led to Catherine's isolation room. From the moment he entered, he sensed something unnatural. The light seemed wrong, dimmer than it should have been, as though the room itself resisted being illuminated. Catherine was seated quietly, wearing a plain gray dress. She watched Thornton set up his camera with unnerving stillness, her gaze fixed on him as if she already knew what he intended. She required no instruction, positioning herself perfectly before he even spoke. For half an hour, Thornton prepared his equipment, and Catherine never moved. When at last he asked her to look directly into the lens, something extraordinary occurred. Thornton later described the sensation as though an invisible force had passed through him. The room's temperature plummeted, and his breath clouded in the air. His hands shook as he adjusted the shutter, not from clumsiness but from a sense that he was not photographing a child, but something much larger and older moving through her. The exposure lasted 15 seconds. For those long seconds, Thornton held her gaze, and the chilling feeling only intensified. He swore later that Catherine was not being photographed by him. He was being photographed by her. When the plate was developed in an adjacent room, the abnormalities began at once. The chemicals behaved strangely, forming patterns Thornton had never seen in decades of work. The image emerged unevenly, some areas developing too fast, others too slow. Finally, the picture appeared, and both Thornton and Hartwell fell silent. The photograph showed Catherine exactly as she had sat. Small frame, gray dress, seated in her chair. Yet her eyes were wrong. They seemed impossibly deep, staring back at anyone who looked, no matter the angle. Viewers felt as though they could fall into those eyes, pulled toward something infinite and terrifying. Her expression, too, was different. Not the neutral face she had worn during the session, but something slightly out of phase, a glimpse of an expression not visible in real time. Even more disturbing were the shadows. Shapes appeared in the background that had not been present in the room. Indistinct figures, blurred forms, as if other presences had been captured alongside her. Thornton checked his equipment, his chemicals, even repeated the process under identical conditions with control subjects. Every control photograph developed normally. Only Catherine's image bore the impossible anomalies. When the photo circulated among the staff, Reactions ranged from fascination to dread. Some claimed headaches and nausea after staring too long. Others refused to look at it a second time. Hartwell himself admitted privately that the photograph was more disturbing than Catherine in person, as though the camera had revealed what human eyes could not. The image would become one of the most studied and debated artifacts in psychiatric history. But for the Doyles, it was something simpler and far more terrifying. It was proof that their daughter was no longer their daughter. Would you dare to look into Catherine's eyes if the photograph lay before you? Share your answer below, and remember to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories where even a single image can freeze the blood. The photograph marked a turning point. From the moment Catherine Doyle's image was captured, her decline accelerated with startling speed. What had once been slow, unsettling changes now became a rapid deterioration, as though the act of being recorded had drained her life. She grew thinner by the day. Her once fair complexion turned pale, almost translucent, with blue veins visible beneath the skin. Her hair, once light brown, darkened to an unnatural black and grew thicker, heavier, as if it no longer belonged to a child. Even her posture seemed to shift, her small frame stiffening in ways that unsettled those who cared for her. Worse than her physical changes were her episodes of complete rigidity. At first, these spells lasted hours, but soon they stretched into days. During them, Catherine did not blink, did not move, did not respond. Her body remained like a statue, but her eyes followed those around her. Staff reported the unsettling sensation that she was aware, perhaps more aware than ever, watching from behind that frozen shell. Whenever these states took hold, phenomena in her room intensified. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the window, even during summer. Objects shifted violently, sometimes thrown across the room with force. Nurses heard whispers in unknown tongues, felt nausea, and saw fleeting shadows move in their peripheral vision. Some refused to enter her room at all. By September 1871, Catherine entered her longest and final state of rigidity. For 6 weeks, she neither ate nor drank, yet she did not die. By all medical reasoning, she should have perished within days. Still she breathed, her heart beating steadily, her eyes wide and unblinking. Occasionally her lips moved, forming whispers no one could hear. Doctors recorded everything, but no explanation sufficed. Then, on the morning of November 2nd, Catherine Doyle closed her eyes. For the first time in months, the air in her room warmed, the frost melted, and the silence was almost peaceful. She exhaled once, softly, and did not inhale again. She was 9 years old, but her death brought no closure. Her autopsy revealed no natural cause. Her organs were pristine, her brain both overdeveloped and underdeveloped in inexplicable ways. Even stranger, her body resisted decay for weeks, remaining unnaturally preserved without chemicals. When she was finally buried in the hospital cemetery, the ground above her grave stayed barren, plants refusing to grow. Visitors reported chills when passing near the site, as if Catherine's presence lingered still. For Patrick and Mary, the nightmare had ended, yet grief consumed them. They had lost their only child not to illness, but to something that neither church nor science could define. And for the doctors who had documented her case, the mystery had only deepened. Catherine Doyle's death raised more questions than it answered, questions that echo more than a century later. If you had stood at her bedside that morning, would you have felt sorrow or relief? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more stories of lives cut short by mysteries darker than death itself. Catherine Doyle's death in 1871 might have marked the end of her short life, but it did not end her story. In many ways, her influence only grew after she was laid to rest. For decades, her case remained whispered among priests, doctors, and local families who claimed to have seen her photograph or heard of her strange abilities. Her name became a quiet legend in Massachusetts, a tale parents told their children in hushed voices when warning them about forces beyond understanding. Within the hospital itself, her records were preserved, though often hidden from public view. Notes by Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Morrison remained in medical archives, their words betraying a struggle between scientific discipline and personal dread. Staff members who had known her spoke less and less, but some confessed on their deathbeds that they had never forgotten the girl who stared at them with eyes that felt older than time. By the early 20th century, Catherine's story began attracting the attention of modern psychology. As psychiatry advanced, doctors attempted to reinterpret her case. Some labeled her a possible savant, a child with extraordinary but misunderstood abilities of memory and knowledge. Others suggested hypermnesia, an abnormal condition of perfect recall, though it could not explain how she spoke languages she had never been exposed to. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung reportedly referenced cases like Catherine's in his writings on the collective unconscious, the theory that humanity shares deep, universal memories and archetypes. While Jung never mentioned her by name, some scholars argue that she inspired his reflections on children who seemed to access knowledge far beyond their own lives. Neuroscientists in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revisited Catherine's story as part of broader studies into extraordinary cognition. They compared her to rare cases of children who could suddenly perform complex mathematics, play symphonies, or recall obscure details after head injuries or seizures. Yet Catherine's abilities far exceeded any medical parallel. Unlike savants who typically excel in one narrow field, Catherine demonstrated impossible knowledge across theology, philosophy, languages, and personal secrets. Science struggled and continues to struggle to categorize her. Paranormal researchers, by contrast, embraced her story as evidence of possession or psychic phenomena. Some argued she was a medium, channeling voices and knowledge from spirits or other dimensions. Others saw her as proof of demonic influence, pointing to her fascination with pain, her blackened eyes, and the failure of an exorcism as undeniable signs. Her photograph became a subject of particular fascination. Paranormal investigators claimed that even reproductions of the image carried an unsettling power, with some viewers reporting headaches, chills, or dreams after staring into her gaze. Catherine's legacy also seeped into culture. Writers drew inspiration from her story for novels and short stories, weaving her memory into Gothic fiction. In recent decades, her name surfaced in documentaries exploring the mysteries of the mind, often alongside tales of possession and unexplained cases in medical history. Online forums debated whether she represented an unsolved psychiatric anomaly or an encounter with something supernatural. For historians, her case stands at the intersection of faith and science during the Victorian age. It reflects a time when society struggled to understand mental illness, clashing between religious explanations of sin and demonic forces on one side, and the emerging science of psychiatry on the other. Catherine Doyle embodied that struggle, becoming a symbol of what neither side could fully explain. And so, more than 150 years later, the question remains, who or what was Catherine Doyle? Was she a child cursed by illness, a prodigy of uncharted abilities, or a vessel for something darker that used her body as a doorway? The truth may never be known, but her story endures, a reminder that some mysteries refuse to die, even when the body that carried them has long turned to dust. If this journey into Catherine Doyle's life and legacy has fascinated you, make sure to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and join the discussion in the comments. What do you believe? Was Catherine Doyle a medical marvel or something beyond this world? Your voice keeps these forgotten stories alive. You have now walked through the life and death of Catherine Doyle, the child who spoke secrets no one should know. From her sudden transformation to her impossible knowledge, from the failed exorcism to the chilling photograph, and finally to her mysterious death, her story continues to haunt both science and faith more than 150 years later. And yet, even after all the evidence, all the reports, and all the theories, the truth remains unanswered. Was Catherine a medical anomaly far ahead of her time? Was she a savant whose abilities broke the boundaries of human understanding? Or was she something far darker, a vessel for forces that neither church nor science could control? What matters most is not only what happened to Catherine, but what you believe happened to her. Now I ask you, if Catherine Doyle stood before you today, with those unsettling eyes and that knowledge no child should hold, what would you think she was? A genius? A victim of madness? Or a messenger of something beyond this world? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Share your theories, your doubts, your fears, because every perspective brings us closer to understanding the shadows that linger in stories like hers. And if this journey into the unknown has unsettled you, don't look away now. There are countless other stories buried in history, waiting to be uncovered. To join us as we bring them back to light, make sure you subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and turn on notifications. Because in this world, the most chilling truths are not always found in the light, but in the shadows.